It's been a while, but we are going to get started back in Genesis. We are going to be on chapter 10. So let's get started in verse 1, and it says, "Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And unto them were sons born after the flood." I'm going to go ahead and give a disclaimer here. I do not know how to say all of these names, so bear with me. But they're going to be tough. Okay, so this chapter is known as the Table of Nations. It was wrote to show how the earth was repopulated after the flood. Okay, remember from Genesis 9:19. Let's read that really quickly. It says, "These are the three sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread." So the earth was repopulated after the flood from these three sons. Also meaning that Noah didn't have any more kids either. It just came from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Okay, and they were born in that order as well. Okay. So, based on historical data, right, we can kind of guess where these three sons settled. A lot of places, a lot of countries get their names from people who settled them, or they name them after people, right? I mean, even if you look at our states, like Georgia was named after King George, or the streets and the cities all were named after people from that region, right? So after the flood, we know that when God had created the earth, he created the earth as one land mass. After the flood, because the fountains of the deep broke, it broke part of the continents, right? It broke the one continent into 6 continents. And right after the flood, they were still very close together because they hadn't drifted apart yet. But that does happen during this Table of Nations, so we're going to look at that too. All right, let's start with the hard stuff. Verses 2 to 5. "And the sons of Japheth, Gomer and Magog, and Madai and Javan and Tubal and Meshech and Tyrus. And the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz and Riphath and Togarmah. And the sons of Javan, Elisha and Tarshish and Kittim and Dodanim. And by these were the isles of the Gentiles, divided by their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations." Okay. So we know that this was wrote by Moses, right? So Moses wrote this in this order for a reason. We know that Japheth was the youngest, but Moses put him first. And then he also doesn't give us much. If you look at, compared to like Ham and Shem's descendants here, Japheth, it's not listed. It's not very long, right? Okay, but there's 2 reasons for that. One, in chapter 9, we see how the boys or the sons of Noah were cursed or blessed. Well, Japheth wasn't cursed, but he wasn't specifically blessed either. Okay. Also, number 2, these descendants had the least to do with Israel's history. They are still important. Also, these are the Gentile nations. We just read in verse 5 that this is where the Gentiles came from. Okay? So, these are also the ones who settled Europe. So, I'm going to tell you, based on speculation and the historical data, where most likely these sons settled, okay, and where these nations came from. So, Gomer is the first son listed, and his sons are Ashkenaz, which they say settled Germany. And actually, a fun fact, the ancient Hebrew word for Germany is Ashkenaz. So, the second son was Riphath, which they say was Asia. The third son of Gomer was Togarmah, and that is associated with Turkey. All right, the second son of Japheth is Magog. Now that should sound familiar, especially if you've read Ezekiel, okay? The Battle of Gog and Magog. That is Russia. The third son is something I can't say, Madai maybe? So that is the Medes, which is an ancient Iranian people. I had to look that up, but the fourth son is Javan, and then it also lists his sons. So his son is Elisha. They settled in Greece. Tarshish, which should also sound familiar if you've read the book of Jonah. You're familiar with that story. That is actually modern day Lebanon. There is Kittim, which is Cyprus, which is an island in the Mediterranean Sea. Dodonim, which is Rhodes, an island in Greece, which is actually also just called Dodonim. So, all right, Japheth's fifth son is Tubal, who settled in Spain. The sixth son is Meshech, which would also be Russia. The seventh son is Tyrus, which, okay, so when I was researching this one, it said the Thracians, which I've never heard of, but it is Bulgaria, Romania, and Macedonia. So we're moving on to Ham. All right, verse 6 of chapter 10 says, and the sons of Ham, Cush, and Mizraim, and Phut, and Canaan. Okay, so Ham had 4 sons, and we've already talked about one of those in chapter 9, and that was Canaan. These will become Israel's enemy. That is what these 4 sons and their descendants will be. This is the family line that is cursed through Ham by Noah. Moving on to 7 and 8. And the sons of Cush, Seba, and Havilah, and Sabta, and Ramah, and Sabekta, and the sons of Ramah, Sheba, and Dedan. And Cush begot Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. So that name Nimrod should sound familiar. Okay, and we're going to remember as we talk about him that he came from Ham. Okay, Ham is his grandfather. So this family line curse is also going through Nimrod. So who is Nimrod? Let's read verses 9 and 10. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Okay, so Nimrod was a king, right? And it says his kingdom began in Babel. We are going to talk about Babel, which is the city, in the next video, which will be chapter 11. But Babel is Babylon, okay? That is what the descendants of Ham are known for. Babylon. Okay, let's keep going. Verses 11 and 12. This is more about his kingdom. And out of that land went forth Ashur and builded Nineveh and the city of Rehoboth and Calah and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, and the same is a great city. So we see further here that they are mentioning Nineveh, which also, if you're familiar with Jonah, you're familiar with that horrible city. There's a reason God sent him there, because it was a horrible city that needed to repent. But anyway, so Nineveh. Geographically, where is that located? Assyria. All right, 13 and 14. And Mizraim begot Ludim, and Anamim, and Lehabim, and Naphtuhim? I'm sorry, I don't know. And Pathrusim, and Calsuhim, out of whom came Philistim, and Caphtorim. Okay, a couple of things here. Mizraim, which is Ham's son, is also known as Egypt. Geographically, northern Africa. That's where they settled. Okay, but if you also look at verse 14, it says that the Philistines came from him. So who are the Philistines? We're all familiar with the most famous Philistine that everyone knows, Goliath, right? But also the Philistines are Israel's #1 enemy. Read the books of Samuel, okay? You will see it is always the Philistines, always. So we see that from Ham came Nimrod and Babylon and Nineveh and Egypt, who will enslave the Israelites, and also Goliath and the Philistines. All right, let's keep going. 15. And Canaan begot Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth. So Canaan was the son that we had already talked about in chapter 9. He was cursed directly, not just through Ham, like Egypt and his other brothers were. They were cursed through their dad. Canaan was cursed directly by Noah, okay? All right, let's read 16 to 18. And the Jebusite and the Amorite and the Girgasite and the Hivite and the Arkite and the Sinite and the Arvadite and the Zemarite and the Hamathite, and afterward were the families of the Canaanites spread abroad. Okay, so these are all the ites, right? These are the ones who have to be driven out of the promised land. So where did they settle? In Canaan, which is the promised land for the Israelites, right? So when we read more into Genesis, and then you get further into the other books of the Old Testament, you're going to see these ites. So remember that they came from Canaan, and they were also cursed twice, essentially, because they were cursed through Canaan, but also cursed through Ham, which is like dad and grandpa, both cursed directly through this bloodline. All right, 19 and 20. And the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, as thou comest to Gerar unto Gaza, as thou goest unto Sodom and Gomorrah, and Admah and Zeboim, even into Lasha. These are the sons of Ham, after their families, after their tongues, in their countries, and in their nations. Okay, so a few other cities here sound familiar. Obviously Gaza, we know where that is. That is in Israel. Sodom and Gomorrah. So we talked about how Ham's descendants would do evil things. We're talking here generational curses through bloodlines, generational sins that travel through bloodlines. Okay, we're going to talk about them more in chapter 19, Sodom and Gomorrah, more of their story. But you see these cities that have come from Ham, these places that when they're mentioned in the Bible, they are not associated with good things. They're actually associated with evil, with sins, like Sodom and Gomorrah, Nineveh, Babylon. Okay, we're going to move on to Shem. Now, he was the one that actually was blessed directly through Noah, Shem. Through his line, we are going to see Abraham and Isaac and Israel and the tribes of Israel and David and ultimately the Messiah, Jesus. That is who is going to come through Shem's bloodline, okay? This is the line of the Jews, God's chosen people, the blessed people. All right, let's read verse 21. Unto Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth, the elder, even to him were children born. Now, the wording here is kind of weird. Kind of sounds like it's saying Japheth is the older one, but Shem is the elder, but he's also the brother of Japheth. So, all right, clearing that up. All right, let's read 22 to 24. The children of Shem, Elam and Ashur and Arphaxad and Lud and Aram. And the children of Aram, Uz and Hol and Gether and Mash. And Arphaxad begot Selah, and Selah begot Eber. Okay, so I'm going to list these names and tell you where they also settled, okay? Elam is Iran. Ashur is Iraq. Arphaxad is Syria. Lud is Turkey. Aram is also Syria. So when the ark landed, or, you know, I mean, it wasn't flying, but like when the waters receded and the ark was on top of the mountain, that area was Turkey or Armenia, right? So they didn't go that far. They kind of settled right there around where the ark would have been. So let's see. Verse 25. And unto Eber were born 2 sons, and the name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Okay, so it says, and it's important, right? They don't put things in the Bible that aren't important, so this is important. It says, in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. So what does that mean? Okay, so we talked about how there was one continent in the beginning, and then during the flood, the continent broke apart, became 6 continents. Well, this is the time during Peleg's time on the earth is when the continental drift happened, when they started to drift apart. And when Moses put this in here, obviously he wrote it when people they would know what he was talking about. They'd be like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, I get that. But it's really interesting if you look at the ancient Greek word for sea is Pelagos, which has his name right there in it, Peleg. Because this is the time that the seas started to be in places where the land used to be. And not only isn't the ancient word for sea, it's specifically talking about open sea or deep. It actually symbolizes mystery. So it's the time where the continents drifted apart and became, more than a mile apart, 3 miles apart. This is when it started to really open up. More drift to where it is now. Okay. If you look at the map, it's obvious to see how all 6 continents fit together at one point. And yes, I said 6 because if you look at it, they fit like a puzzle, and which one doesn't? Antarctica, because it's not a continent. We talked about that. Anyway, let's move on to verse 26. Or at the end of verse 25, it says, his brother's name was Joktan. 26. And Joktan begot Almodad and Sheleph and Hazarmaveth and Jerah. Okay. So Joktan came from Saudi Arabia. Okay, that's the area that his descendants would have been in Saudi Arabia. All right, let's read the rest of these. 27. And Hadoram and Uzal and Dikla and Obal and Abimael and Sheba and Ophir and Havilah and Jobab, and all these were the sons of Joktan. And their dwelling was from Mesha, as it goeth into Sephar, a mount of the east. These are the sons of Shem, after their families, after their tongues, in their lands, after their nations. Okay. So that is telling you that is all the sons of Shem, and that is where they settled. So if you're looking at this, Japheth settled Europe. Okay. Ham would have settled the Israel nation, right? All those areas over there. And then Shem would have been Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, more like the Middle Eastern countries that we think of. All right, last verse, 32. These are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations in their nations. By these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. It keeps saying the nations divided. So obviously these three sons split apart. After the cursing and the blessing, they split apart with their wives. They go and they repopulate their areas of the earth. But if you're looking at a map, they're not really that far apart. Okay? Something happens in the next chapter we're going to talk about to really split the earth apart. And I don't mean physically. The physical part of the earth splitting apart happened in verse 25 here. That is when the earth physically split. But when the earth split, the people split, is going to be in next chapter, in chapter 11. And it's actually one of my favorite stories in the whole Bible because it really explains where we came from. Like, we know we came from Adam and Eve, we know we came from Noah, but how did we get people that speak different languages? How do we get people that are different colors? How do we get people that are different nationalities? How do we get people that look different, but we all came from the same two people? So it explains all of that. Bye, guys.